Good morning. Welcome to another simple truth. We're back in 2 Kings chapter 5. We're talking about the story of Naaman. I'm going through verse by verse and really challenging you to think differently. For some people, it just simply blows their mind that God would use the ungodly in a godly plan. But yet God shows us, and this is an example of that in 2 Kings chapter 5 with the story of Naaman, that God uses a bunch of ungodly people for him to get the glory, for godly purposes. I really challenged you last week to think about this idea of would God purpose for your enemy to get you where maybe your friends are unable or unwilling to get you? Is God willing to not want to provoke you into some kind of emotion, but to provoke you into some kind of an action through the ungodly? And this is exactly where King Ahab finds himself, right? He finds himself in a place where it feels like he's being goaded into some kind of a conflict, some kind of an argument, if not an actual battle with the king of Syria, because the king of Syria demands that he heal his servant. The king of Syria demands that Naaman be healed by the king of Israel. And so this sounds like a God thing, but already we see that the plan has gone a little bit awry. The plan was not for the king of Israel to have anything to do with this. The plan was for the prophet to have something to do with this. I think that's, again, important, especially in our culture today, where we continually looking to the government to do godly things, to dictate, mandate biblical things, when really we should be looking to the spiritual people to do that. So we need to be careful that we're not expecting godly things, right, to be mandated by our government, but that we're looking to God's people for those kind of things. But that we're also willing every once in a while to understand that God can use the ungodly to bring forth godly truth. So I want you to look with me at verse 8. It says, "But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, 'Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel.'" Look at this verse. To me is so important because God gets his plan back on track. It was never for the king to heal Naaman. It was for God to heal Naaman, and that was going to go through his prophet Elisha. And that's what the maidservant, that's what the little girl suggested. That he lived in Israel, he could go see the prophet. And so God gets his plan back on track. Do you know that God does that in yours and my life? That we get sidetracked, that we begin to think we work for God. We start doing what we want to do, what makes sense to us, with the people that make sense to us. And God says, wait a minute, I need you to get back on track. You're going to do it with me, which means I've supplied the resources. I've provided the right people. You need to have your eyes open for those resources and for those people. Like too often, do you know the person that God has planned to carry out his plan is sitting in amongst a group of people. And often we overlook that person to go in a different direction. One that makes sense to us. One that makes sense to all of us collectively. Like this seems like this would be a godly thing. Listen, again and again, we remind you that God says, my ways aren't your ways. My thinking is above your thinking. There too often are times where things collectively make sense to us, but it's not God's plan. And God has to kind of intervene and get things back on track again. But there's damage that's done. I want you to think about this, that in the time that it took for Elisha to hear about the king tearing his clothes, think of the things that could have happened. The king could have gotten an army together and thought, hey, we're going to fight the battle, let's go. The king could have sent a letter back that said, no, I'm not going to do this for you. I can't do this for you. Right? The king could have responded in a million ways. that would have had consequences, that again, God would have had to work through to get back on track. But in this case, before any of those things happened, Elisha heard and responded. He knew that it was a job for God. Listen to what he says again. Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there's a prophet in Israel. Elisha knew what the plan was, that this was a God thing, that these kind of things don't just happen. And so anytime that there's a moment where God can shine, anytime there's a moment where God can get the glory, that is a godly thing, and God's at work, and God's doing something. We simply need to work with him. So Elisha didn't need to know all the details. He simply knew God was at work. What is it in your life today that you're desperately seeking for all the clues, all the information, so you can put it together in a picture so it can make sense to you before you step out in faith? What is it that you might simply need to just know that God's at work? That God wants to show that there's a prophet. God wants to show that there's a godly person in your workplace. God wants to show that he's alive and working in your family, in your church, in your community. God wants to show something. You don't need to know the details. You just simply need to recognize that God's at work. What is it in your life that God is trying to say to you? I'm at work here. Come join me. Help me accomplish my plan, not only in your life, but in the life of those around you. What are you tearing your clothes about today? That God's saying, you know there's a God. You know that I have a plan. Quit tearing your clothes and turn to me.